Hello! It's blowing a gale outside my shed today. I love crazy weather days. I hope you can hear me okay. Welcome back to Ask an Adventurer. Today's first question. How did you come up with ideas? I've answered that question a lot of times. Read some books, look at a map. Do you miss the company of others when adventuring alone? I guess I get lonely when I'm away from home. That's a slightly different question to miss the company of others. I do really enjoy doing adventures with other people. It's great fun and interesting. So I do really enjoy trips with other people, and I find doing trips with myself are more sort of character building, worthwhile, meaningful sort of things. But trips with other people are generally more fun. Until that person starts to do your head in, of course. Next question. When you were young, you travelled all over the world. We talk a lot nowadays about seeing great value in exploring local places. Do you think a young person today would miss out if they don't travel far and instead focus on local adventures? Great question. Well, until 50 years ago, definitely 100 years ago, most people's entire lives were based around local adventures and local holidays. I just read a book. I think it's called The Road. Anyway, it's a history book about a Roman road in Britain. Really interesting. But the point here is that within it, there's this 12-year-old kid back in the 40s who's out all the time around where he lives. I think it's in Essex, finding bits of Roman pottery, trying to work out the course of Roman roads, just discovering amazing stuff. It's fantastic. And what struck me doing that was, like, when I was 12, I would not have been out looking for Roman pottery. Yeah, I mean, I was prattling around in the rivers and climbing trees, but I was not looking for Roman pottery. And I imagine that most 12-year-olds today are definitely not out wandering around their woods looking for Roman roads. They are on TikTok looking at pictures of Rome on their TikTok. So I definitely think in that sense there's great benefits from really exploring locally and immersing yourself in that. However, I also think that quite a lot of my recent evangelizing and appreciation for local exploration is a direct reflection of me realizing how much more I'm starting to pay attention and appreciate things close to home than I did when I was just ticking off ABC, Albania, Bolivia, China, zooming off to all these cool places. Partly, I think that's just because I'm getting old and you make these sort of changes. Partly, I do think it's because I've been to loads of other places that I'm able to appreciate close to home. So I think, to answer in a long rambling way your question, that yes, local adventure and exploration is fantastic, but so too is getting on a bike and cycling off thousands of miles, or getting on a train from where you live and taking it right the way across the country and discovering stuff far away. So definitely I think there's an ideal scope for a bit of both. Do you take Jesus with you on your adventures, and what does that look like? So I grew up in a Christian kind of school, had to go to Sunday school as a kid, we had some church services every day at school. Then when I was at university, I had a really religious friend who also got me into adventuring, actually. He's called Rob Lilwall, if you want to read about his adventures. He was a very adventurous, fun guy, but he's also very religious. So he got me really curious about Christianity through university, but I was sort of teetering around the edges, and I had it culturally ingrained in me from school. And then I set off to cycle around the world and thought, oh, this is great. This is my great sort of spiritual journey, my own time in the wilderness. But I pretty much lost any semblance of faith whilst travelling around the world for a couple of reasons. I did pray from time to time, and in all my time out in the world, I never saw any evidence of God or Jesus. Now, I know that a Christian person might say to me that, oh, that kind person that helped me out in Mongolia was a proof of that. So I get all of that, but I never saw any direct proof. I never saw angels going, oh, or anything that would make me think, wow, this is definitely true. Also, I spent a lot of time in Muslim countries and in lots of other religions as well, meeting good, interesting, kind, devoted people. And I was very struck by the notion that if I'd been born in Lebanon rather than Leeds, I would have been believing that the Quran was the holy book, and that was a true story of the world, rather than what I'd been taught in my Methodist Christian Sunday school. And that incompatibility of, if this is right, then this is wrong, really started to strike me. This cannot be the truthful word of God, and this be the truthful word of God. One of these is wrong, and this means that one of these billion people are wrong, which then got me thinking perhaps both those billion peoples are wrong, and gradually became increasingly atheist. So these days I wouldn't go as far as to say being an atheist, because I think that is an equal leap of faith as being a believer, but I'm massively towards the atheist side of the spectrum. So yeah, Jesus doesn't go with me on my adventures anymore. Having said that, whenever I find a church, I really enjoy going into churches. I really like the peace and the oldness and the calm, and the sense that the vast majority of people who've been in that church over time have mostly been really trying to make the world a better place. And I think that's a thing not to be underestimated in these secular times. Yeah, I find the erosion of a lot of Christianity sad, really. It seems that they're one of the few groups of societies that is okay to slam in a way that you wouldn't do to most other groups. I do feel that's quite sad. So I'm not. Yeah, that's sad. Okay, right. Next question. I know you read a lot. When, where do you read? How much do you do? And what do you fit into your days? Are there periods of time when you read a lot and periods when you don't? Yeah, I do read a lot. I read when I have my breakfast. I read when I have my lunch. Well, assuming I'm alone at the dinner table, of course. I read when I'm waiting for the bus. I read in bed. I read on the toilet. I read. Yeah, I read a lot. Quite often, I sit down when I'm knackered and think, oh, I'm knackered, I'll put something on Netflix. And as I start to scroll, there's like a million things on Netflix, which would all be quite good, but nothing jumps out at me. And almost always, I either then just think, oh, I'll just watch Fail Army on YouTube for 10 minutes, or I rewatch Ben Stokes and Jack Leach Final Hour at Headingley on YouTube, which I've watched a weirdly large number of times. But most of the time I just think, turn off the telly and read a book, because there's so many cool books. I read on my Kindle primarily, which is, I know is not nearly as cool as a paperback, but what's great is it means I've got loads of books on there at once. And what's really great is you can download sample chapters of books on Kindle. So I read a lot of the first chapter of books, and then that helps me decide whether I'm hooked in and I want to actually read the whole book or not. Periods of time where you read a lot, periods where you don't. And now I pretty much read a lot, but what I do is alternate. I go through periods when I read really sort of educational books, learning about stuff. I know the environment. I read 10 books in a row about the environment, then I read 10 books in a row about history, so that sort of stuff. And then I'm like, oh man, I just need to relax. So I read a few sports biographies or fiction books. I always want to read more fiction books, but I always sort of veer away from them. So any suggestions of fiction books, please let me know. I would love to have a selection list of books to read. And if you would like to see some of the books I've enjoyed and read, go into Google and type in Alistair Humphreys, good books I've read recently. And this is a long list I update of the recommended books that I've enjoyed reading. Excellent question. Right, next question. How do you balance your personal life with your demanding career as an explorer and content creator? Well, I think trying to balance that means that I don't really consider myself an explorer anymore. And my content creation has really modified. So I used to really love making films, but they require going away quite a lot, and then they require massive amounts of time, and I can't really do either of those things now. So I've focused on trying to do stuff that fits in around my other commitments. Hence, mostly I do writing these days, writing and exploring locally. So it's been a huge amount of compromise for my exploring life and content creation, but compromises that felt like an important and right thing to do in my personal life. What's the most challenging aspect of planning an expedition and funding it? the most challenging part is funding it. I mean, I hated trying to fundraise for the South Pole. I hated my fate being in other people's hands and having to go cap in hand to people and beg. I hated that, and the false hopes. Oh, I hated it. So I'm much more in the camp of how much money have I got in my bank account? Right, I'm going to go and spend that by doing X, Y, and Z. So save up my own money and go do it. Massive fan of that. Can you share behind the scenes look how you plan and record a podcast episode? So when I do a podcast, the ones that I love, for example, my Living Adventurously podcast, I love that. It's interviewing other people. And before I do that, I would pretty much read everything I could find about that person from the books that they've written, and I type in their name to Google. I probably read the first 3 or 4 pages. That's 30, 40, 50 blog posts and interviews and stuff about them to get a good sense of who they are. And then I try and mull over all the stuff I've learned about this person, and then ask myself, what aspects of this are relevant and unique to my podcast? How can I ask this person interesting questions rather than just the formulaic generic ones they must get asked all the time? And I do that for their sake because it's so boring getting asked formulaic questions, and I do it for my sake to try and make my podcast a bit more original and different and hopefully good. Then I plan a list of questions, and then once you start interviewing them, most of the questions go completely out the window because you end up just following different conversation threads. And I find doing podcasts completely exhausting because you ask a question, you try and listen to their answer, you're trying to keep an eye on your microphone to make sure that the balance audio levels are correct, you're listening to their answer, you're trying to decide, should I carry on with this line of questioning or should I move on to the next question on my question sheet? There's lots of things you're trying to juggle over. And I try and record my podcasts in one take, so without breaks and ums and ahs, and I do that purely for the laziness of keeping the edit really easy. What strategies do you use to stay motivated and creative in your work? Oof. I try to remind myself to keep evolving, to keep asking myself what feels exciting and interesting now, and to try and be aware of my audience and what problems they face in their lives, and to work out how I can address one of those problems with a project. How do you handle the pressures and expectations of being a public figure on social media? Okay, well, first of all, I definitely do not count as a sort of famous celebrity type person, thank God. But I would go along with being a public figure in that most people who follow me on social media aren't my actual real friends. And the way I deal with it is just by really separating my life. I separate my public life, i.e. books and adventures and all that sort of stuff, and I share all that stuff on the internet. And then my non-public life, my actual life, I don't share any of that on social media, and that's just a strict delineation which I've done, which helps me just keep sane, I suppose. That links on to the next question of what's your process for choosing which stories or experiences to share public and which to keep private? Yeah, that's pretty much covered. How's your perspective on exploration and storytelling changed since you began your career? Oh, that's a good question. My perspective on exploration has evolved from feeling that originally that I felt that adventure was quite an elitist sport, a bit like rugby or cricket, and that the best people would rise to the top. And by best, I meant the people going the furthest, the fastest, the hardest, the toughest, the first. So it was a quite sort of competitive, measure yourself against other people sort of adventuring world. And that was the world that drew me in, and I was really interested in just trying to push, compete. But that's very much evolved through my 8 times of doing micro adventures, trying to make it a much broader, more inclusive church that, hey, everyone's welcome in the wild. Just if it feels like an adventure to you, it is. And then that evolved again through my time playing my violin in Spain, which felt like one of the most adventurous things to do in my life ever. And so that suggested to me that adventure's not about walking hundreds of miles through Spain. Adventure's about daring yourself to be vulnerable and to risk failure and uncertainty and do new and difficult and different things. And then I suppose that's evolved now to exploring even more locally, to try and think, wow, what's the point of this? Exploration needs to be about adventure, yes, but plus purpose. You need to be having I like to have some purpose to my adventures, to make it feel a bit less just like a hedonistic, fun hobby, to be actually doing something useful for the world as well. So adventure plus purpose is where I've got to now. Where I've also got to now is a very definite feeling in my tummy that it's time for lunch. Thank you for your questions. Please keep them send them. You know what to do. It's lunchtime. I'm hungry. Bye.